In court, my wife called me a useless husband until the judge asked one question. I want you to understand something before I tell you this story. I am not a man who raises his voice. I never have been. Even as a child, when arguments would break out around the dinner table, I would go quiet. I would fold my hands and I would listen. My mother used to say that still water runs deep. I didn't fully understand what that meant until I was sitting in a courtroom at 52 years old, listening to my wife of 26 years tell a judge that I was useless. She didn't say it with anger. That's the part I keep coming back to. There was no heat in her voice, no trembling lip, no emotion she had to contain. She said it the way you'd read a conclusion from a report you'd already filed, like it was simply the established truth of things. He's just a useless husband. He doesn't understand finances. He never has. And I sat there with my hands flat on the table, palms down, breathing slowly, and I said nothing. People in that room probably thought I was broken. They probably looked at me and saw exactly what Lydia wanted them to see. A passive man. A man who had been carried for years by a capable woman and didn't even have the dignity to argue when she finally said it out loud in front of a judge. I understand how it looked. I understood it then, and I made a choice to let it look that way for a little while longer. My name is Ethan Cole Hartwell. I have spent the last 20 years of my professional life doing work that most people don't fully understand when I explain it. Internal compliance, risk analysis. I sit inside the architecture of financial systems, and I look for the places where things don't add up, where patterns diverge from what they're supposed to be, where small, careful movements have been arranged to avoid drawing attention. It's not glamorous work. It doesn't make for good conversation at dinner parties, but it requires a specific kind of patience, a capacity to observe without reacting, to build a picture over time rather than grabbing at the first thread you find. Lydia had dismissed my work for as long as I could remember. Paper shuffling, she called it. She said it with a kind of fond condescension, the way you describe someone who collects old coins or spends too much time on crossword puzzles. Harmless, but not serious. Not the kind of thing that matters in the real world. She built her entire case on that belief. I want to go back to the beginning, not to the courtroom, but further back, to the kitchen table, to the evening Ryan had just left for college and Hannah was still in high school, and the house had gone quiet in that particular way that happens when the shape of your family shifts. Lydia stood at the counter sorting mail, flipping envelopes with sharp, impatient movements. She didn't look at me. She asked what my plan was. I said, for what? She sighed in that way she had, theatrical, like she was performing exhaustion for an audience I couldn't see. For everything, Ethan. For your career. For us. You just float. I remember nodding. I remember saying nothing. At the time, I told myself that was maturity, that choosing not to argue was the same as choosing peace. What I didn't understand yet, or what I understood but hadn't named, was that silence can be repurposed. That if you go quiet long enough around someone who needs to be in control, your silence becomes their evidence. It becomes proof of absence, proof of incompetence, proof of whatever story they need to tell. Lydia needed a very specific story, and I had been helping her tell it without knowing. Our marriage ran on parallel tracks for most of those 26 years. We were not unhappy exactly. We were not intimate either. We raised children. We coordinated schedules. We showed up to the same events and came home to the same house. She handled people. I handled processes. She liked being visible, admired, consulted. I liked being accurate. Those two things coexisted for a long time without requiring the other to shrink. But Lydia had a hunger that didn't stay contained. And I think somewhere along the way, she decided that control was something she was owed. Not because she was malicious, or at least not primarily, but because she had come to believe that she was the one holding everything together, and that belief had become the whole architecture of her self-worth. So she took more, quietly, incrementally, the way you move things around when you're sure no one is watching. She moved our savings to a different bank without telling me. She added herself as primary contact on our insurance accounts. She told our children to ask her about money because Dad doesn't like dealing with that stuff. Each of these things on its own could be dismissed. Convenient, practical, helpful. Together, they were a map of something else entirely. My mother's name was June Cole. She was one of the most methodical people I have ever known. She balanced her checkbook every Sunday morning with 2 sugars in her coffee and a small notebook open beside her. She kept receipts in labeled envelopes. She knew where every dollar went, and she genuinely believed that paper was memory and that you should never lose it. After my father died, she told me that. Don't lose the paper, Ethan. Paper remembers. When June had her stroke, a mild one enough to blur the edges without removing the woman inside, Lydia offered to help. She said it with such ease, such warmth. Let me handle the logistics, the appointments, the accounts. You focus on your mother. Take the pressure off yourself. And I let her, because June trusted Lydia, because I was tired and grieving in a quiet way I didn't know how to name, because Lydia had always been so capable, because saying no would have required an explanation I didn't have language for yet. Papers were signed, accounts were accessed. Lydia became the point of contact for institutions that had once dealt directly with my mother. She framed all of it as help. She was so good at framing. Then June died, and 3 weeks after the funeral, while the sympathy cards were still sitting in a pile on the counter, and I was still waking up some mornings and forgetting for one quiet second that she was gone, the petition arrived. It came by courier, thick and official, addressed to me by my full legal name. I sat in my car in the driveway for several minutes before I opened it. I watched condensation gather on the windshield. I read the words emergency conservatorship and financial incapacity, and I sat very still and felt something that wasn't quite shock, but wasn't quite anything else either. Lydia was asking the court to appoint her as my temporary financial guardian, not my mother's, mine. She claimed I was unable to recognize exploitation, that I lacked the capacity to manage assets responsibly, that I was emotionally impaired by long-standing disengagement. The irony was almost too precise to be accidental. Within 48 hours, my personal accounts were frozen. My employer placed me on administrative leave out of caution. My access to certain internal systems was suspended. The word incompetent hadn't been spoken yet, but it was present in every interaction, hovering at the edge of every phone call and careful email. My son stopped returning my calls. My daughter sent a single text. Mom says you need help. That night I slept on the couch. Lydia didn't ask me to. She didn't need to. The next morning, I opened my laptop. I want you to understand what it feels like to look at your own life through the lens of your professional training. It is not a comfortable thing. It requires a kind of detachment that doesn't come naturally when the subject is your own marriage, your own mother's accounts, your own name attached to a legal document claiming your incompetence. But detachment is what I had. It was, in some ways, the only asset Lydia had not managed to touch. I pulled bank statements. I requested transaction histories. I built a timeline. I did not accuse Lydia. I did not confront her. I did not call family members and tell them what I suspected. I simply looked at the numbers and I waited for the patterns to speak. They always speak eventually. That's the thing Lydia never understood about this kind of work. You don't force the pattern, you just stay patient and you let the numbers tell you what happened. Small withdrawals, consulting fees paid to a vague entity, transfers just under reporting thresholds, all of it clustered around specific dates. Dates when Lydia had visited my mother alone. Not for appointments, not to accompany June anywhere, just visits, just the two of them in that house in Oak Park. I highlighted them, cross-referenced them, built a spreadsheet. By the end of the week, I had identified transactions totaling tens of thousands of dollars with no corresponding documentation, no invoices, no receipts, no legitimate purpose I could identify. When I asked Lydia about one of them, carefully, neutrally, the way you ask when you don't want the person to know yet how much you already know, she smiled. Don't worry about it, she said. I've got it under control. I looked at her smile and I felt something settle in me. Not anger, not even sadness. Recognition. Lydia believed she was correcting an imbalance. She believed she had earned what she had taken. She believed I would never notice. And that belief, that absolute confidence in my obliviousness, was the foundation on which she had built everything, including the petition, including the claim that I couldn't recognize exploitation. She had constructed the entire architecture of this scheme on the assumption that I was exactly who she had always told herself I was: useless, passive, disengaged. She didn't realize that the very qualities she had dismissed were the qualities that had been watching her for 26 years. I drove to June's house on a gray Thursday morning when the sky was that particular Midwestern gray that makes everything look like it's waiting. Oak Park was quiet. The same brick houses, the same hedges, the same sidewalks my mother used to sweep on Saturdays like someone was grabbing her. I sat in the driveway for a long time before I went inside. The house smelled like lavender and old books. June's smell. The reading glasses were still on the side table, upside down, exactly where she always left them. There was a throw blanket on the arm of the couch, folded in the particular way she folded things, precise, automatic, like her hands knew the shape without being asked. I went straight to the filing cabinet in the spare bedroom. Beige, unremarkable, 4 drawers labeled in her careful block letters. After my father died, she had told me, if something happens to me, you'll know where to look. I opened every drawer. At first it seemed intact, but after an hour things began to fray. Envelopes resealed, statements out of sequence, gaps where originals should have been. I pulled everything onto the bed and started sorting by date. And then I found the power of attorney. It wasn't hidden. It was filed neatly in a folder marked legal. June's signature was there, real, slightly uneven in a way that matched the weeks after her stroke. The language of the document was broad in a way that should have required explanation and independent counsel. But what stopped me wasn't the scope. It was the date. The document had been signed on a day when June's neurologist had noted increased confusion and reduced executive functioning in her records, not incompetence. Vulnerability, enough to make consent questionable, enough to make pressure effective. I photographed everything and kept looking. The journal was in the hall closet, tucked between 2 photo albums, brown leather, soft at the edges. June had always liked objects that lasted. The first entry was dated 15 months before her death, and it was cautiously worn. Lydia called today, said she wanted to help more, sounded sincere. I want to believe it. The entries were short at first. Dates, visits, notes about fatigue, Lydia bringing groceries, Lydia asking questions about accounts, and then gradually the tone changed. Foggy day. Lydia had papers, said they were to help her talk to the bank. I signed, shouldn't have, too tired to argue. 2 weeks later, better day, looked at the papers, power of attorney. I didn't mean to give that, embarrassed. Don't want to trouble Ethan. I sat on the floor of that closet for a long time, not crying, just breathing, in and out. The house quiet around me. My mother's voice in every sentence of that journal, her careful handwriting, her private shame at having been deceived by someone she had chosen to trust. The last entry was addressed to me. If you're reading this, something has gone wrong. I didn't forget who you are. I know what you do. I trusted you to see what I couldn't. I closed the journal. I took copies of everything. I left the originals exactly where they were, because evidence matters more when it hasn't been moved. I called Dana Mercer that afternoon. Dana is the kind of attorney who asks questions the way investigators ask questions, without filling the silence, without steering you toward a conclusion she's already reached. She listened to everything I told her. She asked for dates, names, medical context. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment, and then she said this isn't about notary fraud. It's about exploitation during vulnerability. That's a different category entirely. I know, I said. Which is why, she replied, we have to be careful. We have to let the systems do what systems do. We don't force it. We don't accuse loudly. We build the foundation and we wait for the weight of it to do its work. "What do you want?" she asked me. I thought about my mother's handwriting. I thought about the way she had prepared a trail without knowing exactly when it would be found or by whom. I thought about how she had protected herself not by confronting Lydia, but by documenting, by trusting that paper remembers. "I want the truth to surface on its own," I said, "without me forcing it." Dana was quiet for a moment. Then we wait and we prepare. Over the next 2 weeks, I lived deliberately inside Lydia's assumptions. I did not confront her. I did not accuse. In the preliminary deposition with her attorney, I described my work plainly. Internal audit consultant, compliance support, risk analysis, no embellishment, no credentials volunteered. I watched Lydia via video link. I saw her relax as the deposition progressed. She smiled when I answered simply. She mistook restraint for surrender. Again. Dana worked quietly in the background, requesting bank records through proper channels, coordinating with compliance officers, alerting Adult Protective Services to trigger a parallel review. By the time the hearing arrived, multiple systems were already moving, not because I had forced them, because the pattern had been documented in systems when they function as they're supposed to, respond to documentation. Truth carries more weight when it doesn't rely on a single voice. I learned that doing this work. I believed it absolutely by the time I sat down at the respondents' table in Courtroom 3B. The room was smaller than people imagine when they think of court. No dramatic echo, no gallery packed with observers, just worn benches, fluorescent light, the faint smell of paper and disinfectant that clings to government buildings like a second coat of paint. Lydia stood a few feet away in her navy blazer, and the pearl necklace she always wore when she wanted to look composed but sympathetic. She had practiced this version of herself carefully. I had lived with it for decades. When she said it, "He's just a useless husband," she didn't look at me. She delivered it to the room, to the record, to whatever version of events she was still trying to author. I did not react, not because it didn't land, but because reacting would have served her narrative. And then Judge Sykes asked her question. She looked past Lydia, past her attorney, and she said, "Counselor, are you confident you understand Mr. Hartwell's professional background?" The room changed. Not dramatically, not the way it happens in films, just a shift in atmosphere, the way air changes before weather arrives. Lydia stiffened. Her attorney hesitated. And I understood that the moment my mother had anticipated, had trusted me to be ready for, had finally arrived. I will not walk you through the hearing detail by detail because what happened in that courtroom was not the point. The point was everything that had been built before the gavel fell. The records, the timeline, the journal, the independent flagging by banks, the APS inquiry already underway. Dana presented each piece without theater, without accusation, without asking the court to take her word for anything. She simply showed what the documents showed, described what the dates revealed, and allowed the patterns to speak in the language they speak best, which is the language of undeniable alignment. When Judge Sykes denied the petition, she didn't do it with speeches. She did it with the quiet authority of someone who has spent a career distinguishing between the facts and the performance layered over them. She referred the matter to the district attorney. She told me I had been right to remain silent. I nodded once, and outside those doors, Dana said, "This part is over. The next part won't be." She was right. The systems, once triggered, do not stop at the first truth they find. Banks expanded their review. APS formalized its inquiry. Subpoenas were issued. An intermediary named Janelle Pierce was identified and contacted by investigators. Lydia tried to appear cooperative. She attended interviews. She answered emails promptly. She explained everything as misunderstanding and administrative necessity, and June's preference for handling things quietly. But investigators compare notes, and when they did, the pattern Lydia had arranged so carefully over years, the small movements, the timing, the documentation created after the fact, none of it held the weight of scrutiny she had believed it could carry. My son Ryan took time. His loyalty had been built on Lydia's version of our family for decades, and facts don't immediately dissolve what decades have constructed. He called me one evening and asked about June's old recipe box. He came over and pulled a folded bank notice from his pocket. He'd found it in old files. It had been forwarded to Lydia's email. He held it with slightly shaking hands and said quietly, "I see it now." That was enough. I didn't need him to say more. Hannah began therapy. She called me one night and said, "Dad, I think I messed up." She had seen Lydia wearing June's earrings months before any of this. Family jewelry. Lydia had said June gave them to her, and Hannah had believed her and had said nothing because she was afraid, and because loyalty in families is not always the same as honesty. She told me she didn't know if it mattered. I told her it did, not because it would convict anyone on its own, but because the truth of a thing matters even when it's small, even when you notice it alone in a room. The charges came: financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult, fraudulent documentation, not the maximum, not the minimum, enough to anchor what the evidence had already established. Lydia rejected the first plea offer, then the second. She blamed stress. She blamed the marriage. She blamed me. Then the paper trail closed the remaining exits and she accepted. Class 2 felony. Suspended prison sentence contingent on compliance. 5 years probation. Full restitution with interest. Permanent prohibition from acting as a fiduciary. To satisfy restitution, she was required to liquidate assets, including a property she had purchased quietly under a trust she could no longer justify. I was not in the courtroom when she entered the plea. Dana called me afterward. "It's done," she said. I sat at the kitchen table, the same table where, years ago, Lydia had called me useless for the first time. The same table where I had eaten breakfast that morning of the hearing and folded my hands and thought about what my mother had written. I didn't feel triumph. I felt the particular feeling that comes when something that has been crooked for a long time is finally, quietly, set back into alignment. Not celebration, just the absence of the weight that had been there so long you'd stop noticing it. My employer reinstated me with conditions, additional oversight, periodic disclosures, the slow, institutional process of trust rebuilt through consistency rather than declaration. I accepted it without resentment. Systems don't run on emotion. They run on demonstrated pattern over time. I understood that better than most. There's something I've thought about often in the months since, something about the nature of being underestimated. Lydia believed my silence was emptiness. She believed my restraint was disengagement. She believed that because I didn't perform capability, I didn't possess it. She built her scheme, her timeline, her legal strategy on the absolute confidence of that belief. And I think for a long time, some part of me had started to believe it too. Not consciously, not in the ways you can point to, but in the small daily erosions of living inside someone else's story about who you are. My mother never let go of who I was. Even at the end, even in confusion, she wrote, "I know what you do. I trusted you to see what I couldn't." She had held my identity when I was no longer holding it myself. That's a kind of love that doesn't have a category. I sold June's house in Oak Park in late autumn. The closing was on a cold, clear morning, and on the last day before the sale completed, I walked through the empty rooms one final time. The echo of my footsteps, the kitchen where she had kept her Sunday ritual, the closet where I had sat on the floor and read her words. I placed her journal on the kitchen counter. I stood in the quiet for a moment. I said out loud to no one or to her, I didn't look away. Then I closed the door. I've been carrying this story for a long time without knowing how to tell it. Not because it's too painful, but because the shape of it doesn't fit the way people expect stories like this to be told. There's no single dramatic moment. There's no confrontation where the truth explodes into the room. There's no speech, no final reckoning where everything is said aloud and everyone finally understands. There's just quiet work, patient documentation, the careful, persistent belief that if you build the foundation accurately and you wait, The weight of what's true will do what weight always does. It settles. It presses downward through everything that was placed on top of it. It finds the level. I've met people who were written off, dismissed, quietly erased by someone who was certain they wouldn't notice, slowly persuaded by accumulation rather than by argument that the story someone else was telling about them was accurate. I know what that erosion feels like. I know the particular exhaustion of carrying the knowledge of what's true while living inside a version of yourself that someone else constructed and insisted upon. I want to say to those people something simple. Silence is not the same as absence. Calm is not the same as weakness. The fact that you haven't fought loudly doesn't mean you've surrendered. And being underestimated is only dangerous if you begin to believe it yourself. My mother kept a journal no one knew about. She documented her own confusion with the same precision she used to balance her checkbook. She left a trail in the knowledge that someone would eventually come looking. She trusted me before I fully trusted myself. Paper remembers, she told me, and she was right, it always does. If this story found something in you, I'd like to know. Leave a comment and tell me where you are in the world, what time it is where you're watching, what part of this stayed with you. These things don't exist in isolation. They live in the parts of ourselves we rarely speak aloud. And if you want to keep walking through stories like this, stories that move slowly and trust you to stay with them, there are more ahead. I'd be grateful to share them. Asians, risk management, I believe. The judge tilted her head just a fraction, and you're certain that's the full picture. There was a pause, not long, but long enough for the room to notice. Lydia turned toward me then, her expression tightened just slightly. She wasn't afraid yet, but something had shifted. I had not planned for this moment to arrive so early. I had expected to sit quietly through another hour of testimony before anything changed. But Judge Sykes had a habit, one I recognized from watching her preside over unrelated matters years earlier. When something didn't add up, she asked direct questions sooner rather than later. That habit was the reason I was there. 3 weeks earlier, Lydia had filed an emergency petition asking the court to appoint her as the temporary financial conservator over me. Not over my mother, over me. She claimed I was unable to recognize exploitation, unable to manage assets responsibly, and emotionally impaired by long-standing disengagement. Within 48 hours of that filing, my personal accounts were frozen pending review. My employer placed me on administrative leave out of caution. My access to certain internal systems was suspended. The word incompetent hadn't been spoken yet, but it hovered. I did not protest publicly. I did not accuse Lydia. I did not call family members to argue my case. I read, I've spent most of my adult life working in compliance and internal risk analysis, not the flashy kind. I don't chase headlines or testify regularly in courtrooms. I support investigations. I review financial systems. I document inconsistencies and advise companies when something feels off. Occasionally, rarely, I've been asked to explain findings in legal proceedings. Quiet work, uncelebrated work Lydia had always dismissed as paper shuffling. When my mother, June Cole, suffered a mild stroke 8 months earlier, Lydia had offered to handle the logistics, appointments, accounts, documents. She said it would take pressure off me while I focused on caregiving. I let her. June trusted Lydia, or perhaps she trusted the marriage. Either way, papers were signed during periods of fatigue. Accounts were accessed for convenience. Lydia became the point of contact for institutions that had once dealt directly with my mother. Then June died. 3 weeks after the funeral, Lydia's petition arrived, sitting in that courtroom. Listening to my wife describe me as useless, I felt something unexpected, not anger but clarity. Lydia wasn't improvising. This was a plan that required me to remain exactly who she believed I was, quiet, unobservant, disengaged. She didn't realize that silence had never meant I wasn't paying attention. Judge Sykes tapped her pen lightly against the bench. "Mr. Hartwell," she said, finally turning to me, "you've remained silent so far. Is that intentional?" "Yes, Your Honor." "Why?" I met her gaze. "Because this petition depends on assumptions, and assumptions tend to collapse when facts are introduced too early." The courtroom stilled. Lydia inhaled sharply. Judge Sykes studied me for a moment longer, then nodded. "Very well," she said. "Miss Mercer, you may proceed when ready." Dana Mercer, my attorney, rose slowly from her seat, and Lydia Hartwell, for the first time since filing that petition, looked uncertain. The first time Lydia called me useless, it wasn't in court. It was at our kitchen table years earlier on an evening that smelled faintly of burnt coffee and lemon cleaner. Ryan had just left for college. Hannah was still in high school. The house felt quieter than it ever had, like it was waiting for something we didn't know how to name. Lydia stood at the counter sorting mail, flipping envelopes with quick, irritated movements. She didn't look at me when she spoke. "So, what's your plan?" she asked. For what I said. She sighed, sharp and theatrical. "Everything, Ethan, for your career, for us, you just float." I remember nodding. I remember saying nothing. At the time, I thought restraint was maturity. I thought silence kept arguments from becoming scars. What I didn't understand yet was that silence can be repurposed. Over time, Lydia turned it into evidence. Our marriage had always run on parallel tracks. We shared a house, raised children, coordinated schedules, but our inner lives rarely intersected. Lydia liked visibility. She thrived on being seen as competent, admired, indispensable. I liked systems. I liked order. I liked knowing that if something went wrong, I could trace it back to its source. She handled people. I handled processes. At least that's how it started. Gradually, Lydia took over anything that required a signature. She moved our savings to a different bank without telling me. She added herself as the primary contact on our insurance. She told the kids to ask her about money because Dad doesn't like dealing with that stuff. When I pushed back gently, she framed it as reluctance. "You hate responsibility," she'd say. "I'm helping you." And because I didn't want to fight, I let it go. The shift with my mother happened quietly. June had always been meticulous with her finances. She balanced her checkbook every Sunday morning with a cup of coffee, 2 sugars, a splash of milk. She kept receipts in labeled envelopes. She liked knowing where every dollar went. After my father died, she told me paper is memory, don't lose it. When she started forgetting small things, I noticed before Lydia did, or maybe Lydia noticed and didn't say anything. Either way, Lydia stepped in with confidence that felt reassuring at first. She scheduled appointments. She spoke to the bank. She told me she'd take care of the boring parts. "You already do enough," she said. "Let me handle this." June trusted her. Lydia was family. She was warm, attentive, capable. When Lydia brought documents to sign, June didn't question them. She was tired. She was recovering. She assumed good faith. I assumed it too. The first red flag came months later when Lydia mentioned casually that she'd been moving things around to simplify June's accounts. I asked what she meant. She waved it off. "Just housekeeping," she said. "You don't need to worry, but worry is a habit you don't unlearn easily." After June's funeral, the house filled with the usual rituals, casseroles, sympathy cards, conversations that never quite reached the point. Lydia took charge. She coordinated with the funeral home. She handled phone calls. She thanked people on my behalf. 3 weeks later, I received the petition. It arrived by courier, thick and official, addressed to me by my full name. I sat in my car in the driveway for several minutes before opening it, watching condensation beat on the windshield. When I finally read the words, "Financial incapacity, emergency conservatorship," they felt surreal, like they belonged to someone else's life. Lydia was asking the court to appoint her as my temporary financial guardian. Not because I had made reckless decisions, not because I had lost money, but because, according to her, I was unable to recognize exploitation. The irony didn't escape me. Within days, my accounts were frozen pending review. My employer placed me on administrative leave out of an abundance of caution. No accusation, no explanation, just suspension. Years of steady work reduced to a waiting period. Ryan stopped returning my calls. Hannah sent a single text. "Mom says you need help." That night I slept on the couch. Lydia didn't ask me to. She didn't need to. The next morning I opened my laptop and started where I always did, with records. I didn't accuse Lydia. I didn't confront her. I didn't call family members to defend myself. I pulled bank statements. I requested transaction histories. I built a timeline. Patterns don't announce themselves. They reveal themselves slowly if you're patient. It took most of the day before I noticed the alignment. Small withdrawals, consulting fees, transfers just under reporting thresholds, all clustered around specific dates. Dates Lydia had visited my mother alone. I highlighted them, cross-referenced them, built a spreadsheet. By the end of the week, I had identified multiple transactions totaling tens of thousands of dollars that did not correspond to any documented expense. When I asked Lydia about one of them carefully, neutrally, she smiled. "Don't worry about it," she said. "I've got it under control." That was the moment something shifted inside me. Not anger, not betrayal, recognition. Lydia didn't see herself as stealing. She saw herself as correcting an imbalance. She believed she deserved control because she believed she had carried us for years, and she believed truly that I would never notice. That belief was the most dangerous thing she carried into court, because silence, once mistaken for absence, becomes a liability, and Lydia had built her entire case on the assumption that I had none. I didn't go back to my mother's house right away. That surprised even me. For days after the petition arrived, I stayed in our home, moving through rooms that suddenly felt provisional. Lydia was careful during that time, not kind careful. She spoke slowly, as if volume alone might trigger something fragile in me. She reminded me of appointments I didn't have. She offered to handle things I hadn't asked her to touch. She was building a record, so I waited. When I finally drove to June's house, it was a gray Thursday morning, the kind of Midwestern gray that flattens everything, makes colors recede. Oak Park was quiet, the neighborhood unchanged in ways that felt almost accusatory. Same brick ranches, same hedges trimmed just enough. Same sidewalks my mother used to sweep every Saturday like someone might be grating her. I parked in the driveway and sat there longer than necessary, hands resting on the steering wheel. The house didn't look like a crime scene. It looked like a life paused mid-sentence. I let myself in. The air smelled like lavender and old books. June's smell. The living room was tidy but lived in. A throw blanket folded over the arm of the couch. A stack of library books on the side table. Her reading glasses upside down exactly where she always left them. I went straight to the spare bedroom. June kept her records in a 4-drawer filing cabinet, beige and unremarkable. Utilities, medical, banking, taxes. She labeled everything in neat block letters. After my father died, she told me, "If something happens to me, you'll know where to look." I opened every drawer. At first, nothing looked wrong. Statements were there, correspondence, copies of checks. But after an hour, patterns began to fray, envelopes resealed, statements out of sequence, gaps where originals should have been. I pulled everything onto the bed and started sorting by date. That was when I found the power of attorney. It wasn't hidden. It didn't need to be. It sat in a folder marked legal file neatly between older documents. June's signature was there, real, uneven in a way that matched the weeks after her stroke. The language was broad, too broad. It granted authority over financial decisions without meaningful limitation. But what caught my attention wasn't the scope. It was the timing. The document was signed on a day June's neurologist had noted increased confusion. Not incompetence, just vulnerability. Enough to make consent questionable. Enough to make pressure effective. I photographed the document and kept searching. The journal came later. It was tucked between 2 photo albums in the hall closet, a brown leather notebook worn soft at the edges, the kind of thing you don't buy by accident. June had always liked objects that lasted. The first entry was dated 15 months before her death. Lydia called today. It read said she wanted to help more. Sounded sincere. I want to believe it. The entries were short at first. Dates, visits, notes about fatigue. Lydia bringing groceries. Lydia asking questions about accounts. Then the tone shifted. Foggy day. Lydia had papers, said they were to help her talk to the bank. I signed, shouldn't have, too tired to argue. 2 weeks later. Better day. Looked at papers, power of attorney. I didn't mean to give that. Embarrassed. Don't want to trouble Ethan. My chest tight. The last entry was addressed to me. If you're reading this, something has gone wrong. I didn't forget who you are. I know what you do. I trusted you to see what I couldn't. I sat on the floor of that closet for a long time, not crying, just breathing. When I left the house, I took copies of everything. Originals stayed where they were. Evidence matters more when it hasn't been disturbed. That afternoon, I called Dana Mercer. Dana didn't react emotionally when I told her what I'd found. She asked questions, precise ones, dates, names, medical context. She listened the way investigators listen, without interrupting, without filling silence. "This isn't about notary fraud," she said when I finished. "It's about exploitation during vulnerability." "That's worse," I said. "Yes," she replied, "which is why we have to be careful." She explained how these cases actually unfold. Adult Protective Services gets involved. Banks flag irregular activity. Courts look at capacity on a spectrum, not a binary. Lydia's petition wasn't just aggressive, it was risky. If the court believed June had been vulnerable, everything Lydia touched would be scrutinized. "What do you want to do?" Dana asked. I thought of the journal, of my mother's careful handwriting, of the way she protected herself without confrontation. "I want the truth to surface on its own," I said, "without me forcing it." Donna was quiet for a moment, then we wait and we prepare. Over the next 2 weeks, I lived deliberately within Lydia's expectations. I didn't confront her. I didn't accuse. I answered her attorney's questions minimally during the preliminary deposition. When asked about my work, I described it plainly. No embellishment, no credentials, volunteer. Internal audit consultant, compliance support, risk analysis. Lydia watched the deposition via video link. I saw her relax as it progressed. She smiled when I answered simply. She nodded when I didn't explain myself. She mistook restraint for surrender. In the background, Dana worked. She requested bank records through proper channels. She coordinated with compliance officers who flagged transactions that didn't match stated purposes. She quietly alerted Adult Protective Services, triggering a parallel review, not an accusation, and inquiry. By the time the hearing approached, multiple systems were moving independently. That was important. Truth carries more weight when it doesn't rely on one voice. The night before the hearing, I returned to June's house one last time. I didn't go inside. I sat in my car, parked along the curb, watching the porch light cast a familiar glow. I thought about how my mother had prepared for this without knowing exactly how it would unfold. She hadn't raised her voice. She hadn't accused. She had left a trail. In court the next morning, when Lydia spoke and Trent repeated her narrative, I stayed silent. When Judge Sykes asked her question, when the room paused, I understood that we had reached the point my mother had anticipated. The point where quiet work begins to speak for itself. Courtroom 3B felt different after the judge's question. Not louder, not tense in the way people expect. It felt alert, as if the room itself had leaned forward, waiting to see which version of reality would hold. Judge Sykes didn't rush. She adjusted her glasses, glanced once at the case file in front of her, then looked directly at Dana Mercer. "Miss Mercer," she said, "you may proceed." Donna stood slowly. No dramatics, no packing. She placed one hand on the table, grounding herself, and spoke in a tone that suggested she wasn't here to argue, only to clarify. "Your Honor, Dana began this petition is built on the assertion that Mr. Hartwell lacks the capacity to recognize financial exploitation. What we intend to show is that the opposite is true, and that the exploitation occurred because someone believed he wouldn't notice." She started with the bank records. Not all of them, just enough. A simple timeline appeared on the monitor. Dates on the left, transactions on the right, withdrawals, transfers, and payments labeled as administrative support and consulting. Nothing flashy, nothing obviously criminal on its own. These transactions, Dana said, pointing to the screen, occurred over a 10-month period. Each coincides with a visit by Miss Hartwell to June Cole's residence. Not to medical appointments, not to banks, to the residence. Trent Walden rose halfway out of his seat. "Objection." "Overruled." Judge Sykes said calmly, "Proceed." Dana didn't linger. "Next," she said, "we address the power of attorney." She did not accuse Lydia of forging it. Instead, she framed it clinically. This document was executed on a date when Miss Cole's neurologist documented increased confusion and reduced executive functioning, not incompetence. Vulnerability. Judge Sykes leaned forward slightly. "In Illinois," Dana continued, "capacity is not binary. Consent obtained during vulnerability, especially without independent counsel, requires scrutiny." Lydia crossed her arms tightly. Donna moved on. After execution of this document, Miss Hartwell gained expanded access to Miss Cole's accounts. That access coincides with a marked change in transaction behavior. She clicked to the next slide. Prior to this date, Miss Cole's spending patterns were consistent for over a decade. Utilities, groceries, pharmacy. Afterward, we see discretionary withdrawals with no corresponding invoices, no medical billing, and no documentation supporting their stated purpose. Trent objected again. This time his voice lacked confidence. Judge Sykes overruled him without looking up. Dana paused. "Your Honor," she said before proceeding further, "I believe context is important." She turned slightly toward me. "Mr. Hartwell," she said, "can you explain briefly what your role has been professionally for the last 20 years? I stood. "I work in internal compliance and risk analysis," I said. "I help organizations identify irregular financial behavior and systemic weaknesses. Most of my work happens before anything becomes public." "Have you testified in court?" the judge asked. "Yes," I said a few times, when companies needed to explain findings, not frequently. Judge Sykes nodded. She turned back to Trent. "Counselor," she said, "was this background included in your assessment of Mr. Hartwell's capacity?" Trent hesitated. We understood his role to be limited. That Judge Sykes replied evenly appears to be an assumption. Lydia stood abruptly. "He doesn't like attention," she said sharply. "He hides behind spreadsheets. That doesn't make him competent." Judge Sykes raised a hand. "Miss Hartwell, sit down." Lydia didn't argue, but her jaw tightened. Dana resumed. She did not introduce the journal yet. Instead, she presented a summary from Adult Protective Services, not a conclusion and inquiry. A PS had been notified. A preliminary review had begun. Banks had flagged irregularities independently. This court, Dana said, was asked to intervene because Ms. Hartwell claimed her husband could not recognize exploitation. Yet multiple institutions did so without his prompting. The judge's expression changed. "M. Mercer," she said slowly, "are you suggesting that this petition itself triggered a broader review?" "Yes, Your Honor, and that review is ongoing." "Yes." Silence settled again, heavier this time. Judge Sykes folded her hands. "Ms. Hartwell," she said, turning to Lydia, "you requested emergency authority over your husband's finances. Based on what I've heard, that request appears premature." Lydia opened her mouth, then closed it. "I am denying the petition," Judge Sykes continued with prejudice. She paused. "And given the evidence presented and the independent inquiries now underway, I am referring this matter to the district attorney for further review." The words landed softly, but they landed. Lydia's shoulders dropped, not in shame, but in calculation. She had lost control of the timeline. Judge Sykes looked at me again. "Mr. Hartwell," she said, "you were right to remain silent." I nodded once. As the gavel struck, I felt no surge of triumph. Only a sense of alignment, like something that had been skewed was finally straightened. Outside the courtroom, Dana leaned toward me. "This part is over," she said quietly. "The next part won't be." I knew that because when systems begin to move, they rarely stop at the first truth they uncover. The courthouse doors closed behind us with a sound that felt final but wasn't. Outside, the air carried the sharp edge of early spring, cold enough to keep people moving, not cold enough to excuse staying inside. Dana walked beside me toward the parking lot, her pace measured. "The petition's denied," she said, "but that's not the end of this." "I know," I replied. What surprised me was how little relief I felt. The denial had lifted an immediate threat, but it hadn't restored anything Lydia had taken. Accounts were still under review. My employer was still cautious. My children were still caught between versions of the same story. And now the systems had noticed. Within 48 hours, the audit expanded. It didn't happen dramatically. There were no sirens, no confrontations. Banks simply did what banks are trained to do when Adult Protective Services opens a preliminary inquiry. They widened the scope. June's accounts were examined alongside any joint accounts Lydia had access to. Transaction histories were requested going back years, not months. Patterns were compared across institutions. Dana called me that night. "A PS is involved formally now." She said, "They're not accusing, they're documenting. That matters." "Does Lydia know?" I asked. "Not yet," Dana said, "but she will." Lydia didn't come home that evening. Instead, she sent a text, short clip, performative. "We need to talk. You embarrassed me today." I didn't respond. The next morning, my phone rang before 8. Ryan. His voice was tight, controlled in the way people sound when they're trying not to choose sides. "Mom says the judge overreacted," he said. "She says you set this up." I leaned against the kitchen counter and closed my eyes. "What do you think?" It paused long enough for me to hear traffic through the phone. I don't know, he admitted. She's always handled things. You've always stayed out of it. That's not the same as not paying attention, I said. He exhaled. Hannah's upset. She hasn't called, I said. She's scared, Ryan replied. Mom told her to stay out of it. That tightened something in my chest. Tell her she doesn't have to choose, I said. She just has to tell the truth to herself if no one else. Ryan didn't answer right away. Okay, he said finally. I'll tell her. We hung up and the house felt cavernous. Later that afternoon, Dana forwarded an email from a bank compliance officer. The tone was neutral procedural. The content wasn't. Multiple transactions had been flagged as inconsistent with stated purposes. Several payments routed through a third-party consulting entity raised concerns due to lack of ledger and supporting documentation. A request for additional information had been sent to the account holder, Lydia. She'll panic, Dana said when I called her. That's when mistakes happen. I didn't want Lydia to panic. Panic makes people unpredictable. I wanted her to explain. Explanations leave trails. 2 days later, APS contacted me directly. A caseworker named Elaine Morris introduced herself over the phone. Her voice was calm, practiced. We're conducting a standard review related to June Cole's account, she said. We'll need to speak with you and your wife separately. Of course, I replied. Elaine asked about June's habits, her routines, her independence before the stroke. I answered carefully, truthfully. I didn't accuse Lydia. I described facts, dates, observations. Elaine took notes and thanked me. We'll be in touch, she said. Lydia came home that night late, carrying attention she didn't try to hide. They're questioning me, she snapped, dropping her purse on the table. Banks, some social worker. This is your fault, I looked at her. She looked smaller somehow, not diminished, but compressed by the weight of scrutiny. This is the result of your petition, I said evenly. You asked for oversight, she scoffed. I asked to protect the family. By declaring me incompetent, I replied. Her eyes flashed. You are incompetent, Ethan. You don't understand how things work. I almost smiled. Almost. Tell them that I said. She stared at me, then turned away, jaw clenched. The next week stretched thin. APS interviewed Lydia. Banks requested clarifications. Dana coordinated with investigators, careful not to interfere. My employer extended my administrative leave, citing ongoing external review. No promises, no timelines. Ryan visited once briefly. He sat on the edge of the couch and avoided my eyes. She won't answer questions directly, he said quietly. Mom, she keeps saying people are twisting things. Do you believe her? I asked. He hesitated. I don't know what to believe. That's honest, I said. Hannah called 2 nights later. Her voice shook. Dad, I think I messed up. You didn't, I said immediately, whatever it is. She told me she'd seen Lydia wearing June's earrings months earlier. Family jewelry. Lydia had said June gave them to her. Hannah hadn't questioned it at the time. Now she wasn't sure. I didn't tell anyone, Hannah said. I was afraid Mom would be mad. You can tell APS, I said gently. You don't have to accuse, just say what you saw, she sniffed. Will it ruin everything? I thought about June's journal about quiet preparation. No, I said it clarifies things. The audit findings came in pieces, not all at once. Each piece aligned with the next. Transfers routed through a third party, payments justified vaguely, documentation created after the fact. Then Dana called me one evening, her voice lower than usual. They identified the intermediary, she said. A woman named Janelle Pierce. Not licensed, not bonded. She's been contacted by investigators. Did she respond? I asked. Yes, Dana said carefully with counsel. That mattered. It meant Janelle wasn't acting impulsively. It meant this would unfold the way real cases do, slowly, deliberately, with consequences measured in months, not moments. Dana paused. Ethan, she said, be prepared. This will take time. Relationships won't snap back. Some things won't return to what they were. I looked around the kitchen, the same table where Lydia had once called me useless, the same quiet corners where assumptions had hardened into truth. I'm not looking for everything to go back, I said. I'm looking for things to be honest. That's usually harder, Dana replied. When I hung up, I sat alone with that thought. Honesty doesn't rush. It accumulates. And once it does, it doesn't disappear just because someone wants it to. The call from Dana came on a Tuesday afternoon, the kind that pretends to be ordinary until you answer it. They've contacted Janelle Pierce formally, she said. With counsel present, she hasn't confessed to anything, but she's cooperating. I sat at the dining table. My laptop closed, the house quiet in that way it had learned to be. What does that mean exactly? It means she's answering narrowly, Dana replied. Providing records when compelled. No speeches, no texts. This is how people protect themselves when they realize the ground has shifted. I nodded even though she couldn't see me. That was consistent with everything I'd seen so far. People who think they're in control improvise. People who know they're exposed follow procedures. Over the next 3 weeks, the investigation expanded in small, methodical steps. APS completed its initial assessment and referred the matter to the county. Bank compliance units issued follow-up requests. Subpoenas were drafted, not dramatic, just precise. Every request pulled another thread. Lydia tried to regain control by appearing cooperative. She attended interviews. She answered emails promptly. She framed every transfer as a misunderstanding, every payment as administrative necessity. She leaned heavily on the idea that June had wanted things handled quietly and that I had never taken an interest. Investigators listened. Then they compared notes. The pattern didn't change. What changed was Lydia's tone. She stopped calling me incompetent and started calling me manipulative. She told Ryan I was weaponizing my job. She told Hannah I was letting outsiders tear the family apart. Each version contradicted the last. Each conversation left more residue. Ryan withdrew. He didn't defend her anymore, but he didn't confront her either. When he visited, he spoke in fragments. Questions without conclusions. I let him. Loyalty isn't something you pull apart quickly without doing damage. Hannah, on the other hand, started talking. Not all at once, not easily. She described moments she hadn't thought mattered. Her mother asking her to run errands to the bank, instructions to keep conversations vague, reminders to stay out of grown-up stuff. None of it was incriminating on its own together. It sketched intent. Dana cautioned me not to draw conclusions aloud. Let them assemble the picture. She said, "Your job is to remain consistent." That consistency mattered when the district attorney's office finally reached out. Assistant State's Attorney Renee Alvarez requested a meeting. No accusations, just a conversation. Dan and I met her in a modest conference room downtown. Renee didn't waste time. "We're looking at potential charges related to financial exploitation of an elderly adult," she said. Possibly fraud, possibly forgery, depending on how certain documents were used. I asked the only question that mattered. "What happens next?" "Evidence review," she replied. "Witness cooperation. If charges are filed, we'll offer a plea. If not accepted, we proceed." She looked at me carefully. "This won't be quick." "I'm not in a hurry," I said. That night, Lydia finally confronted me directly. She waited until the house was quiet, until the children were gone, until it felt safe to control the narrative again. "You did this," she said, standing across from me in the living room. "You could have stopped this at any point." I looked at her, not angrily, not defensively. "I didn't start it," I said, "and I can't stop what I didn't create." She laughed, a brittle sound that didn't reach her eyes. "You always hide behind that procedure systems. You act like you're above this." "I'm not above it," I replied. "I'm inside it." Her expression shifted then, not to fear exactly, but to calculation. "They won't put me in prison," she said. "Not for this." I didn't answer. 2 weeks later, Lydia was charged. The indictment listed counts under Illinois law related to financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult and fraudulent documentation. Not the maximum charges, not the minimum, enough to anchor the case. She was not arrested in a dramatic sweep. She was notified through counsel and surrendered voluntarily. The process was procedural, predictable, public record, but not spectacle. Trent Walden withdrew as her attorney the following day. The plea negotiations took months. Lydia rejected the first offer, then the second. She insisted on explanations that contradicted the evidence. She blamed stress. She blamed marriage. She blamed me. Finally, the paper trail closed the remaining exits. The transfers, the intermediary, the timing, the power of attorney executed during documented vulnerability, the absence of independent counsel for June, the inconsistencies Lydia could no longer reconcile. She accepted a plea to a Class 2 felony. The sentence reflected what these cases often do when the numbers are significant, but the defendant has no prior convictions. a suspended prison sentence, 3 years contingent on compliance, 5 years of probation, full restitution with interest, mandatory financial disclosure, and a permanent prohibition from acting as a fiduciary or managing another person's assets. To satisfy restitution, Lydia was required to liquidate assets. The house went on the market, not ours, hers, a property she'd purchased quietly the year before under the name of a trust she could no longer justify. I wasn't present when the judge accepted the plea. Dana was. She called me afterward. "It's done," she said. I sat at the kitchen table and let that settle. It didn't feel like victory. It felt like weight redistribution, like something heavy had finally been placed where it belonged. The consequences extended outward. My employer reinstated me, but not immediately. There was a probationary period, additional disclosures, quiet monitoring, no punishment, just caution. I accepted it. Some systems forgive slowly. Ryan took longer. He oscillated between anger and grief, not always sure which belonged where. We talked. We didn't resolve everything. That wasn't the point. Healing, I learned, doesn't follow verdicts. Hannah began therapy, then asked if I'd come with her to a session. I did. Lydia sent a letter through her attorney months later, shorter this time. Still no apology, just regret shaped like self-defense. I didn't respond. Some conversations don't require closure. They require distance. One evening, after the house had quieted again, I opened June's journal and read the last entry once more. "If you're reading this," she'd written, "it means you didn't look away." I closed the book. The systems had spoken. Now it was my turn to live with what they'd said. The first time I woke up and realized the case was truly over. Nothing felt different. No rush of relief, no sense of triumph, just quiet. It was early before 6. The house was still the kind of stillness that used to make me uneasy. I lay there listening to it, realizing that for the first time in over a year, the quiet didn't feel like something waiting to be broken. The plea had been entered 3 weeks earlier. The paperwork finalized, restitution schedules approved, probation terms set. Lydia was no longer fighting, not because she had accepted responsibility, but because there were no moves left that didn't make things worse. Justice, when it comes, rarely announces itself. It settles in like weather. The financial consequences were slower. Lawyers had to be paid. Audits had costs. Even with restitution, ordered money doesn't return all at once. I sold my mother's house in Oak Park in late autumn, not because I wanted to, but because it made sense, because holding on to it would have meant clinging to something that had already served its purpose. On the last day before closing, I walked through the empty rooms one final time. The house echoed, not with ghosts, just with absence. I stood in the kitchen where June had once balanced her checkbook every Sunday morning, 2 sugars in her coffee, a small notebook always open beside her. I took the journal from my bag and placed it on the counter. I didn't look away, I said quietly, not to anyone in particular. Then I closed the door. Work resumed gradually. My employer reinstated me with conditions, additional oversight, periodic disclosures, a quiet reminder that trust, once shaken, takes time to rebuild, even when you're not the one who caused the fracture. I accepted that without resentment. Systems don't run on emotion, they run on consistency, and I knew how to be consistent. Ryan didn't come around right away. Months passed where our conversation stayed careful, almost scripted. He was polite. He asked about work. He avoided talking about his mother. I didn't push. Loyalty doesn't vanish. Just because facts arrive, it has to unwind on its own. The turning point came unexpectedly. He called one evening and asked if I still had June's old recipe box. I found something, he said. He came over that weekend and pulled a folded piece of paper from his pocket. A bank notice dated years earlier, addressed to June, forwarded to Lydia's email. I found it in Mom's old files, Ryan said quietly. She never mentioned it. I don't know why. I looked at him at the way his hand shook just slightly as he held the paper. "It's okay," I said. "You don't have to fix this, I know," he replied. "I just needed you to know. I see it now." That was enough. Hannah's healing looked different. Therapy helped. Distance helped. She didn't excuse Lydia, but she didn't sever herself completely either. She learned slowly that loving someone doesn't require defending their choices. Watching her learn, that taught me something too. Lydia never apologized. She complied. She attended mandated sessions. She paid restitution. She followed probation terms, but remorse, real remorse, requires looking inward. And Lydia had spent too long outsourcing that work. I stopped expecting it. Months later, I received one final letter, not from Lydia, but from the court clerk, confirmation that restitution had been completed, that June's estate was officially closed, that chapter sealed. I sat at the kitchen table that evening with nothing spread out in front of me. No documents, no timelines, no spreadsheets, just a cup of coffee and the quiet I'd once mistaken for emptiness. I thought about the word useless, how easily it had been said, how confidently it had been believed. Silence doesn't mean ignorance. Calm doesn't mean weakness. And being underestimated is only dangerous if you believe it too. Lydia thought my quiet made me invisible. She thought my restraint meant disengagement. She thought paper was something you could rearrange without consequence. She forgot that paper remembers. If you're still here, thank you for listening, for staying with this story through its uncomfortable parts. If you've ever been dismissed, overlooked, or quietly erased by someone who thought you wouldn't notice, I'd like to hear from you. Leave a comment and tell me where you're watching from. Tell me what time it is there. These stories don't exist in isolation. They live in the spaces we recognize ourselves. And if you want to keep walking through stories like this, stories about dignity and the long arc of quiet justice, subscribe. There are more ahead, and I'd be honored to share them with.